If you've attended a leadership seminar, read a management book, listened to a business podcast, or spent more than 15 minutes on LinkedIn over the last decade or so, you've probably heard the same message repeated over and over again. Empathy is the ultimate leadership superpower. Great leaders are empathetic. Great managers are empathetic. Great organizations are empathetic. At this point, if someone published a book titled Empathy, the Cure for Literally Everything, it would probably sell a few 100,000 copies during the pre-sale before it even launched. Unfortunately, like so many other corporate buzzwords, empathy isn't all it's cracked up to be. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a bit deeper into something that came up during the main episode. Now, before anyone starts drafting an angry email, let me be clear. I am not arguing for cruelty, indifference, or treating people like malfunctioning office equipment. It's quite the opposite, in fact. But I do think we've stumbled into a bit of a semantic trap. When most people praise empathy, what they actually mean is kindness, understanding, compassion, patience, or simply paying attention to another human being. Those are all valuable qualities. The problem is that empathy, in its most literal sense, means something much more specific. It means feeling with another person. It means emotionally resonating with their experience, absorbing some portion of their fear, grief, anxiety, or distress into yourself. And that's where I started getting uncomfortable with the way empathy was being promoted in management circles. Back when I was supervising teams, I used to argue against empathy in the workplace. Not because I was heartless, but because I noticed a pattern. Whenever I began feeling with an employee, when I emotionally absorbed their panic about a deadline, their anxiety about a project, or their frustration with the workplace conflict, my decision-making usually got worse. Instead of stepping back and evaluating the situation more clearly, I found myself reacting to the strongest emotional signal in the room. I wasn't solving problems anymore. I was performing some sort of emotional triage. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. Imagine a coworker comes into your office in full panic mode. Right? Their project is behind schedule. Their stress level is somewhere between house on fire and, oh my Lord, it's a meteor strike. If you absorb that emotional state, you don't just understand their distress. You begin experiencing it for yourself. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Their urgency becomes your urgency. And before long, you're making decisions, not because they're the best decisions, but because you're desperately trying to make that uncomfortable feeling go away. Over time, I discovered something that worked much better. Instead of trying to feel with people, I learned to feel for them. Now, that's a subtle distinction, or at least it seems that way, but it turns out to be an incredibly important distinction. I could care deeply about someone's well-being without taking their emotional state into my own nervous system. I could listen carefully, acknowledge their struggle, genuinely want to help without emotionally bleeding alongside of them. In other words, I could practice sympathy or compassion rather than catching their emotional virus, which is really what empathy is all about. At the time, I thought this was just a management preference. Maybe it was a personality quirk of mine. Maybe I was just wired differently than the empathy evangelists who seem to be running every leadership conference in America. But as we'll see in a moment, modern neuroscience has uncovered something rather fascinating. The difference between empathy and compassion isn't just a matter of philosophy or management style or even semantics. Your brain processes them in fundamentally different ways. And one of them is far more likely to leave you exhausted, overwhelmed, and frankly, incapable of helping anyone at all. Look, for years, I assumed my skepticism about empathy and leadership was just based on experience. I'd seen what happened when managers became emotionally entangled in every crisis that crossed their desk. They started to get overwhelmed. They became reactive, and they were exhausted. But I figured that was just an observation from the trenches. I didn't have any data to support that. It's just what I was seeing with my own two eyes. Then I started reading some of the neuroscience, and I discovered that, well, I had stumbled onto something that wasn't just my personal management preference. It was a biological reality. One of the leading researchers in this field is Dr. Tanya Singer. She's a social neuroscientist who spent a lot of years at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences. So her work was focused on, I think, what was a fascinating question. What actually happens inside the brain when we empathize with another person's suffering? Not what we think happens, not what sounds good in a leadership seminar. What literally happens inside our nervous system? So to answer that question, Singer and her colleagues placed participants into fMRI scanners, machines that allow researchers to observe changes in brain activity in real time. So participants were shown people experiencing pain or distress or emotional suffering. In some cases, they were specifically instructed to try to empathize. In other words, they were told to really try to put themselves in the other person's shoes and try to feel what that person was feeling, which is what empathy is. And the results were pretty striking. When participants practiced emotional empathy, the brain's pain network became active. Areas like the anterior insula and the mid-cingulate cortex all lit up. You don't need to memorize those names. Shit, I can barely pronounce those names. The important point is what they do. These are the regions that are associated with processing pain or threats or feelings of distress. The brain was responding as though the suffering the person was observing was, in some sense, happening to the observer as well. I mean, think about that for a moment. Your brain is remarkably sophisticated in so many ways. It can perform complex calculations, can recognize thousands of faces. Hell, it can convince you that pineapple belongs on pizza, for Christ's sake. But when it comes to empathy, it can be surprisingly unsophisticated. It doesn't make a clean distinction between I am suffering and I am deeply resonating with someone else's suffering. The result is something researchers call empathic distress. The more suffering you absorb, the more overwhelmed you get. Suddenly, a lot of modern life starts making sense. Think about how many of us carry around a 24-hour news feed in our pockets. At any given moment, we can witness a war, a natural disaster, a political crisis. Hell, those happen every few minutes. An economic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and thousands of people arguing on social media about something that won't matter by next Monday. But if empathy means absorbing all of that suffering, and no wonder so many people feel exhausted. We've essentially turned ourselves into emotional vacuum cleaners, and then we act surprised when our emotional dustbin overflows. We're wired for empathy. That's a significant problem. But here's where Singer's research becomes, I think, even more fascinating. Her team also studied what happened when participants practiced compassion, when they intentionally practiced compassion instead of empathy. So rather than feeling with the suffering person, participants were trained to feel for them. They focused on care, concern, and the desire to help without emotionally absorbing all the distress itself. This time, entirely different regions of the brain lit up. Instead of pain networks, researchers observed activity in areas like the ventral striatum and the medial orbitofrontal cortex. Again, the names aren't important. What matters is that these regions are associated with positive motivation, caregiving, feelings of reward, and resilience. Instead of creating distress, compassion appeared to generate energy. Instead of overwhelming the observer, it prepared them to help. Now, that's an extraordinary finding. Empathy and compassion often get lumped together as though they're interchangeable. Neuroscience suggests, they're not. They're not interchangeable. One creates a state that resembles sharing another person's pain. The other creates a state that supports effective caregiving. One tends towards emotional exhaustion. The other tends towards sustainable action. So in very practical terms, this means the most effective helper isn't necessarily the person who feels the worst. It's not the person who can best empathize with others. The best leader isn't the one who absorbs every ounce of anxiety from their team. The best caregiver isn't the one who collapses under the weight of everyone else's suffering. The most effective helpers, they are often the people who can remain emotionally present without becoming emotionally consumed. That's a difficult lesson because many of us, so many of us, have been taught that suffering alongside of someone is the highest form of caring. But according to the neuroscience, if your goal is to actually help people, then compassion is likely far more powerful than empathy, because compassion allows you to stay engaged, stay clear-headed, and stay effective long after emotional empathy would have left you just burned out and unable to continue. That brings us to an even bigger problem, though. If empathy can overwhelm us as individuals, what happens when we try to use it as a guide for fairness, justice, and social decision-making? If burnout were empathy's only problem, that would be serious enough. Right? But there is another issue that may be even more troubling. Emotional empathy doesn't just exhaust us, it also biases us. And once you see this bias, it's pretty hard to unsee it. One of the people who helped bring this issue into public discussion is a guy by the name of Paul Bloom. He's an evolutionary psychologist who taught for a lot of years at Yale University. Several years ago, he startled the academic world and the general public by publishing a book with a title that sounded, at the time, almost heretical. And it was titled Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion. Now, predictably, a lot of people assumed Bloom was arguing against caring about others. He wasn't. In fact, his argument is remarkably similar to what we've been discussing. He wasn't attacking compassion. He was questioning whether emotional empathy is actually a reliable guide for making fair decisions. Right? So Bloom's his central insight is that empathy behaves like a spotlight. Imagine standing in a dark room and you're holding a flashlight, right? Wherever you point the beam, that becomes incredibly vivid. And because of that, it becomes important. Everything outside the beam fades into the darkness. That's how emotional empathy works. It locks onto a single person, right? A single story, a single face, a single emotional experience. That individual suddenly becomes the center of your moral universe. This is why charitable organizations, Well, they often feature one child on the commercial rather than statistics about thousands of children. It's why a heartbreaking personal story can move us a hell of a lot more than a report that's just filled with all the data. That's why a dramatic news story can dominate public attention, while the larger systemic problems, well, they tend to just remain sort of invisible. Our empathy doesn't naturally scale. It doesn't operate like a floodlight illuminating everyone equally. It operates like a very narrow spotlight focused on whoever happens to be directly in front of us. Now, let's bring this back to management, because this is where I first encountered the problem in real life. Imagine you're supervising a team, and one afternoon, an employee comes rushing into your office, just on the verge of tears. They're overwhelmed by an approaching deadline. Right? Their voice is shaking as they're talking to you about the anxiety. The anxiety is just obvious. You can see the stress all over their face. You can hear it in their voice. Every instinct in your body wants to make their pain stop. If you're operating primarily through emotional empathy, something very predictable happens. Your brain locks onto that person's distress. Their suffering becomes the most important fact in the room. To reduce the discomfort for them and for yourself now, you decide to move the deadline or redistribute the work a little or make some other accommodation. At first glance, that sounds compassionate. It sounds like good leadership. It certainly feels like kindness. But here's the question empathy often prevents us from asking. What happens to everyone else? Remember, your empathic spotlight was focused solely on that person in front of you, so everyone else was in darkness. You didn't see the 3 other employees who were quietly carrying their share of the workload, but now have to carry even more. You couldn't see that they were also stressed. One of them had a sick parent at home. Another was struggling with anxiety, but it just wouldn't dream of bringing that into your office. The third one was just, frankly, introverted and uncomfortable displaying strong emotions in front of you, the supervisor. Those struggles were just as real and just as important, but they were invisible. That's where the spotlight becomes dangerous, where the empathic spotlight becomes dangerous. As the manager, you weren't responding to the needs of the entire team. You were responding to the most emotionally visible signal. By relieving the burden of the employee who came into your office crying, you may have inadvertently doubled the burden on 3 people who were suffering in silence. The loudest pain received your attention. The quieter pain disappeared into the shadows. Notice what happened here. You weren't being selfish. You weren't being malicious. You weren't trying to play favorites. You were being empathetic. And yet the result was unfair. That is Bloom's point. Emotional empathy often feels moral because it connects us so strongly to individual suffering. But fairness requires something more than emotional resonance. Fairness requires us to consider everyone affected by a decision, including the people we can't see at that moment. The people who aren't crying, the people who don't look like us, and the people whose stories don't trigger our emotional circuitry. In other words, empathy is excellent at helping us notice suffering. It's terrible at helping us distribute our attention fairly. And once we understand that, we can begin to see why compassion is such a powerful alternative. Compassion asks, how can I help? Empathy often asks, how can I make this feeling stop? One question leads toward thoughtful problem solving. The other can lead toward emotional favoritism. Now, let's bring this back to the gospel reading that inspired this week's broader discussion. In Matthew 9, We're told that Jesus looked upon the crowds and felt compassion because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Most religious interpretations stop right there. The emphasis is often placed on the emotional experience itself. Jesus sees suffering. Jesus feels compassion. End of lesson. Compassion becomes a kind of spiritual emotion, almost a supernatural state of your heightened concern. But if we slow down and look at the structure of the story, something a lot more interesting comes from it, right? Notice what Jesus does not do. He doesn't sit down and individually absorb the suffering of every person in the crowd. He doesn't spend the next 6 months emotionally processing the pain of thousands of strangers until he collapses from burnout. No, instead, his compassion immediately triggers action. In fact, it triggers organization. The very next thing that happens in the narrative is the formation of a team. 12 disciples are identified. Responsibilities are delegated. Instructions are given. Boundaries are established. A mission is defined. Resources are mobilized. Whether you view the story as sacred history, theological storytelling, or ancient mythology, the structure is unmistakable. Compassion is translated into systems. As a former manager, that's the part that jumps off the page for me. Imagine walking into a community and discovering that hundreds or thousands of people need help. The empathy response might be to become emotionally overwhelmed by just the sheer magnitude of the problem. The compassion response is to ask a different question. All right, how do we scale assistance? How do we organize people? How do we distribute scarce resources fairly and effectively? How do we build a system that can reach more people than any single individual ever could? That's exactly what happens in this story. And from a secular humanist perspective, that's where the real wisdom just might be hiding. One of the challenges facing modern activism, nonprofit work, community organizing, even informal helping networks, one of the problems they face is that we often celebrate emotional engagement more than effective outcomes. We praise people for caring deeply, for feeling deeply, for expressing their concern publicly, making emotionally charged speeches. Those things, well, they certainly have value. But caring about a problem and solving a problem, they're not the same thing. Think about something as straightforward as a food bank. It doesn't function because thousands of people wake up every morning and emotionally absorb the hunger of strangers. It functions because people create schedules, they manage inventory, they coordinate volunteers, they've got established procedures, they track donations, they've built sustainable systems to support all of this. Obviously, the people running the food bank probably care passionately about what they're doing, but what actually feeds people is not their passion. It's not how they feel about it. What feeds people is the structure they've built. The same principle applies to almost every major challenge facing humanity. We don't solve climate change through emotional resonance. We solve it through policy, technology, cooperation, and a lot of long-term planning. We don't reduce poverty by feeling poor. We reduce poverty through education, economic opportunities, effective institutions, social support systems that remove barriers to entry for people. We don't improve accessibility. Speaking of barriers to entry, we don't improve that because people feel the frustration of every disabled person they meet. We improve accessibility by creating better standards, building better processes, training people properly, and just embedding inclusion and accessibility into the system itself. This is why I think Matthew's story can be read as sort of an ancient blueprint for what Paul Bloom calls rational compassion. The suffering of the crowd, what matters, it really does. The emotional response matters. But the real power of the story, that lies in what comes next. Compassion becomes organized. Concern turns into action. Our feelings, Jesus' feeling for the people, became a structure. That's a lesson that applies just as much to atheists and humanists as it does to religious believers. If our communities rely solely on emotional empathy, our attention will always gravitate toward the most visible suffering. We'll help the people who look like us. We'll respond more to the stories that move us emotionally. We'll focus on the loudest voices and the most dramatic crises. But the quiet, invisible, the unglamorous forms of suffering, we're going to overlook those unintentionally. But systems don't have to operate that way. A well-designed system can care for people whether or not they're emotionally visible. A fair process can protect people who never tell their story. A healthy institution can distribute resources according to need rather than according to emotional impact. That's one of humanity's greatest achievements. We've learned, imperfectly and incompletely, we've learned how to build structures that extend compassion beyond the limits of our personal emotional wiring. Maybe that's the deeper lesson hidden within this ancient story. Compassion isn't measured by how much pain we absorb. It's measured by how effectively we reduce suffering. The goal isn't to become emotionally overwhelmed by the crowd. The goal is to build something that helps the crowd. All right, as I attempt to wrap this up, I'd like to turn the mirror toward a group that includes myself and many folks listening today. Progressive humanists, socially conscious people, even compassionate Christians, really anyone who takes pride in being an empathetic person. Because here's the uncomfortable question. What if empathy isn't really the virtue we think it is? For years, many of us have treated empathy as one of the highest moral achievements. We celebrate it in our leaders. We encourage it in our children. We tend to use it as a shorthand for being a good person. And yet, if everything we've discussed today is correct, empathy contains a flaw that is pretty difficult to ignore. Because the fact is, empathy is inherently selective. Think about your own life. Who is it easiest for you to empathize with? Probably people who share your experiences, people who speak your language, people who understand your worldview, people whose struggles make sort of intuitive sense to you, people who belong to your tribe, whatever that tribe happens to be. Look, that's not a character flaw. That's just how human beings are wired. A progressive activist may feel deep empathy for marginalized communities while struggling to understand a conservative factory worker who's afraid of losing their job to someone they see as a foreigner. A conservative Christian may feel tremendous empathy for members of their congregation, but then they find it almost impossible to understand the experiences of an LGBTQ teenager. A manager may empathize a hell of a lot more readily with high-performing employees who remind them of their younger selves than they do with workers whose backgrounds are just very, very different from their own. And empathy naturally follows familiarity. And that's precisely the problem. Because acceptance, fairness, and justice, they require us to care about people even when our emotions don't automatically cooperate. If our commitment to human dignity depends entirely on whether we can emotionally resonate with someone's experience, then our concern will always be uneven. Some people are going to get our attention because they trigger our empathy. Others are going to be ignored because they don't. The result is not universal compassion. The result is simply tribalism. That's why I think acceptance, the value we explored this week in the main presentation, I think acceptance requires something stronger than empathy. Acceptance asks us to recognize the worth of every person, not just the people whose stories move us. It asks us to extend concern beyond our emotional comfort zone. Acceptance asks us to care about people we don't fully understand, people we don't particularly like, and even people whose lives bear very little resemblance to our own. In other words, acceptance requires principle. Luckily, principles are usually a hell of a lot more reliable than emotions. I don't need to feel exactly what another person feels in order to believe they deserve dignity. I don't need to absorb their fear, their grief, or anger, or pain in order to defend their rights. I don't need to share every aspect of their experience in order to recognize their humanity. In fact, sometimes maintaining that emotional distance, it allows me to help more effectively. I think that's the paradox at the heart of this whole conversation. The goal is not to become cold. The goal is not to stop caring. The goal, it's not to build a world full of detached rationalists wandering around like human computers. The goal is to care wisely, to care sustainably, to care fairly. The goal is to build communities and institutions that extend compassion beyond the limits of our emotional wiring. So I guess here's my final afterthought. Let's stop trying to bleed with the world. It's making too many of us exhausted. It's making leaders reactive instead of thoughtful. It's encouraging us to prioritize the loudest suffering while overlooking all the quieter forms of need. And despite our best intentions, trying to emotionally bleed with the world can end up deepening those tribal divisions that we claim to oppose. Instead, let's step out of that blinding spotlight of empathy and into that steadier light of rational compassion. Right? Let's care deeply. Let's listen carefully. Let's act courageously, and let's build systems that help people. Let's protect human dignity wherever we find it threatened. But let's remember that we don't have to catch someone else's emotional virus in order to fight for their well-being. We don't have to suffer exactly as they suffer in order to stand beside them. And we don't have to feel with everyone in order to care for everyone. Ultimately, that may be the most sustainable form of acceptance we can offer ourselves and the diverse human family that we're all trying to build together. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. It provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes about 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.